I suggested that for the talk today, that you read a couple of articles, and I don't know if you had the chance to do that. I hope you did, because I'm going to come back to that article. This is Innovation's Darker Future, Biosecurity, Technologies of Mass Empowerment, and the Constitution. But I wanted to try to provide a context for talking about this article. And as Peter said, since I've been here, or while I've been here in Ashbrook, and I want to thank Peter and the Ashbrook Center for making that possible. It's really been a great experience. Not least of which was reading the history plays, which turned out to be a wonderful thing. But I've been working on espionage, which is what we do to uncover things overseas we need to know. And what I want to talk about more today is the extent to which we want the government to have the power to uncover things we do here in the United States. And if you've read the article, you know that it's Benjamin, I think his last name is pronounced Wittes. It's his view that the way biotechnology is developing is going to call into question some very fundamental conceptions we have about about what the government should do and how we should live as citizens in a government like the one we've enjoyed for more than 200 years now. So what I wanted to do to begin was just to provide a broader context for that discussion. And I wanted to do it to start by connecting with something that Reed Browning talked about. It wasn't the central part of his discussion, but he brought it up in his discussion at the last colloquium. And it's really an account of how the modern nation state and modern government developed. What caused it to develop the way it did. And how the United States, and what I want to talk about is how the United States managed to escape that kind of government for a long time, and why that changed slowly through our history, and how now today, again, to get back to Wittes's argument, how that might be changing in a very fundamental way. So I intend this to be relatively brief, and then I hope we can just talk about these things. There are a lot of different aspects to this. There's these questions about biotechnology, but there are other ways we can talk about it, and they'll raise the same kind of issue. All right. So let me just start quickly with the context. If you remember, Professor Browning was saying that he was talking about the War of the Austrian Succession, and that was one of a number of wars that took place in the 18th century. And from the viewpoint of the British government, that series of wars really stretched back into the 17th century. And the reason to mention Britain is because Britain really invented modern government. And everybody else ultimately copied what they did, including ultimately the United States. So from the British perspective, there's a period of 150 years. I mean, historians, I guess, you could dispute how long this lasted, but at least say from the Restoration, so the last third of the 17th century through the Napoleonic Wars, so the first decade or so of the 19th century, a series of wars. And Britain ultimately came out on top. They defeated the French being their primary opponent. One important, very important reason they did this, Nelson was important, Battle of Waterloo, we know all that, but what made Nelson possible? And what Professor Browning mentioned was something that people call the fiscal military state. The British discovered the most efficient way possible to extract resources out of the British population and direct those resources to fighting war. And because they did it more efficiently than anyone else, particularly the French, they ultimately defeated the French. France was, in the 17th century, the richest country in Europe, largest population, and the British ultimately defeated them. It's because they developed an efficient way of extracting resources from their population. And one of the principal ways they did this, they had, as Professor Browning mentioned, they had a land tax. The land tax was administered in a decentralized way, and it wasn't very effectively collected. And what the British did was that they had for a number of years what was called an excise tax, which is a tax on trade inside their domestic trade. They didn't want to tax foreign trade because they're a commercial nation. They didn't want to discourage it or put a burden on it, so they taxed the trade that their population carried out. And the system they developed was very centralized. If you want to tax people selling beer, candles, soap, you have to actually know how much they're selling. Right? So they developed an administrative function that tracked that so they could collect taxes on it. But not surprisingly, the British population didn't like paying these taxes, and they would, believe it or not, they would try to hide their soap and candles and the beer and stuff so that the government couldn't get a good estimate of what they were actually trading. So that to make the excise work, the British had to give authority to excise officers to enter people's homes to search for what they might have in stock. And if you remember, if you've read, for example, Franklin's autobiography, you know that at this time, businesses and homes were often in the same building. So a search of somebody's business was often a search of their home. And because people would dispute with the government naturally over how much they owed and what they had, the excise system had its own courts, its own administrative functions to judge people and ultimately to take their property. So the reason this was key was because given technology in the 18th century, wars were fought to a point of exhaustion, which really meant a kind of fiscal exhaustion. Sometimes more or less there was a decision on the battlefield, but often these battles, these wars went on until one side got exhausted. So whichever side could recover financially the quickest would have an advantage, because then they could dictate when the next war started and where it started. So driven by that necessity, the British became very ruthless at collecting these excise taxes. And one thing that this did disturb the British population, and it also disturbed people who were looking at the development of the British government and the relationship between that government and the freedom of British citizens. Blackstone, who was a commentator on the laws of England, and from Jefferson's viewpoint, very suspect. Jefferson considered him to be too favorable to the royal government, to the powers of the king. But even Blackstone said that this excise system was hardly compatible with the temper of a free nation. But it's because of this excise system that the British were able to become the world-class power, or in large part, they were able to become the world-class power that they became. And anybody who wanted to compete with them had to ultimately develop a similar system. And the French found this very difficult. And ultimately, they lost that competition. Now, from my viewpoint, being a Jeffersonian, what's very interesting about this system is that it's exactly the system that Alexander Hamilton wanted to impose on the United States. So there are a couple of other components of it. One is there was the British developed a bank, the Bank of England, to support their financial operations. The British were able to borrow. Not only did they raise money for their wars through taxes, but they couldn't raise enough to carry on the war, so they had to borrow a lot of money. The reason people were willing to lend money to the British government at reasonable rates of interest was because they knew that the British were very good at extracting money from their population. And the British government reinforced this sentiment in people who had money to lend by saying we will designate a portion of our tax revenue to pay off our debt. So anyone who lent money to the British knew that the British government would pay off the debt because by law it designated a certain portion of its tax revenue to do that job. That's what a funded debt is. That was another component that Hamilton wanted to impose on the United States. So a bank, a funded debt, an excise. Remember the Whiskey Rebellion is fought because of this tax on whiskey that the people in Western Pennsylvania don't want to pay. This was all the British system of government, and it did make Britain a power. But Hamilton, and that's what Hamilton wanted to, as I say, impose on the United States. And the reason I say impose, and this was the great argument, a way of describing the great argument between Hamilton and Jefferson. The reason I say impose is because from Jefferson's viewpoint, there was absolutely no necessity to have that system of government. Why? Because we had no enemies. Now, that is not quite literally true, but Jefferson, always an optimist, thought that it was close enough to the truth that it could guide our policy. And because, and the key thing for Jefferson was, all of the systems that Hamilton was hoping to copy, the ultimate effect of them would be to limit freedom. And for Jefferson, that was unacceptable because there was no compulsion to do that. We didn't face an enemy like France, in the way the British did. You know, south of the border, there was ineffective government, Spanish-controlled, and not any threat to the United States. Once the War of 1812 is over, no real threat from Britain. Even earlier than that, I would say there was really no threat from Britain. So from Jefferson's viewpoint, we don't need this large military establishment. And since we don't need that large military establishment, why do we need this system of government that the British have to live under, which has so distorted their politics and made impossible this, not impossible, but has diminished the freedom of British citizens. So Jefferson looked to the west, famously to all this open land, and he said that's really where America should direct its energies. We can raise our revenue by selling off that land. We don't need this tax system. And I think that largely the Jeffersonian view dominated the United States for the next 100 years. So apart from the Civil War, there's very little need for any government of the United States to raise an army, a big army. Very little need for this system that's not only does it take resources, extract resources from the population, but compels the government to get into the business of its citizens in ways that Jefferson thought government shouldn't, because they'll restrict freedom. There are two things that start to change this. One is industrialization, and the second is the development of technology. So as militaries start to apply modern technology to war, their ability to project their power over great distances increases. And this was apparent to some people once ships began to operate through steam, for example. It became apparent to people that the United States wasn't as isolated and as safe behind these two large oceans as it had been. But there was great resistance in the United States to the idea that we ought to alter the way we had done things, because nobody felt that threat was quite so pressing. It really took the Second World War to change that in a way. So I would argue that the Jeffersonian understanding actually persisted until the Second World War. And during that war, people, even before that war was over, people began to think about what the next war would be like. And the argument that developed that Great Britain won't be able to protect us, as it has in effect as it did in effect before the first two world wars. The Third World War, we are going to be immediately engaged. And that means we have to fundamentally alter the way the US government does business. And there were a whole series of policies that were proposed to deal with these new developments. The thing that made this most evident to everybody was the development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Those will quickly cross the ocean or the Arctic and hit the United States. So how do we respond? So there's a whole series of proposals. Universal military training, for example. Industrial policy, right? The US government has to have the authority to tell companies what to produce. What kind of industrial capacity are we going to need to fight and win the Third World War? Well, the government has to actually direct the economy to produce those things. How does the government interact with the economy? Is there a way for the government to increase the productive capacity of the economy generally? And there were all sorts of proposals to do this. The interesting thing is that almost none of these proposals actually passed in the form in which they were first proposed by the people whose job it was to think, national security experts whose job it was to think about these things. They were defeated often, watered down, changed, defeated in the Congress. Another person who was critical in this was President Eisenhower, who thought that this understanding, these proposals that even people in his own administration were making, were simply incompatible with a free government. And ultimately, not only were they incompatible with our freedoms, but they would actually turn out to be inefficient, less effective, et cetera, et cetera. So Eisenhower was very important in preventing a lot of these proposals from coming to pass. People who heard about these proposals, the phrase that developed was that they're going to result in making the United States a garrison state, meaning that everything about the United States will be focused on winning the next war. A lot of the traditional freedoms that we enjoyed will be subordinate to that. So if you're worried about a nuclear attack, it means you have to disperse your population. It means you have to disperse industry. So people won't be free to live wherever they want to live. We actually have to discourage them from living in certain areas and see that they move to other places. You know, North Dakota would be good, Wyoming. And there may be reasons why there aren't a lot of people in North Dakota and Wyoming. Nothing against, you know, those wonderful, great states of North Dakota and Wyoming. But you could think about that. If you think about that for a minute, is the government actually going to tell me where I need to live or where I can open my business? Can the government tell the steel industry that it can no longer be concentrated in certain areas of the Midwest? Or now we would say, what about the information technology industry? It can no longer be concentrated in Silicon Valley. It has to be dispersed. One of the things that happened as these debates occurred was people would say, well, look, what if we do that, how do we differ from the Soviet Union? If we have a planned economy like that, how do we differ from the Soviet Union? It's not worth it. We shouldn't do that. Ultimately, as I say, these proposals were defeated, and we got nothing like what people feared we might have, which is called a garrison state. So the Cold War was fought largely with a government of limited powers. Not that much different from the government that the United States had enjoyed for previous 150 years of its existence. And that remained true, I think, all the way through 2001. And there were, in response to 2001, a lot of changes that were proposed. Patriot Act, for example, was one that people point to. Again, lots of effort to figure out if we're under this new threat, How should the government respond? How should the American people live? Right? So a lot more security at airports. You know, we now take our shoes off, which some people, I think, believe is a grave affront to our freedoms. Maybe that's right, maybe that's not. But lots of changes occurred. Right? So the overall point with that context is that the modern state has the character it has largely in response to security threats. And if you look at British and at American history, I think you can see that what we understand to be the threats we face has to a large degree dictated the kind of government we've had. The point that Wittes is bringing up is a version of that argument. He's saying if you think about the way biotechnology is developing, and you think about the kinds of people who might use it, this is going to mean a fundamental change in the way the government is organized and the way we have thought about our security. So if you, this is on the second page of his article, he says, the past few decades have seen an ever-augmenting ability of relatively small non-state groups to wage asymmetric conflicts against even powerful states. The groups in question have been growing smaller, more diffuse, more loosely knit, and technology is both facilitating that development and dramatically increasing these groups' ultimate lethality. So the point he draws from that is that there are two things going on. There's an erosion of the government's monopoly over the ability to kill large numbers of people. That power to kill large numbers of people is no longer a government monopoly. And as the future goes on, it will be less and less a government monopoly. And what he says correspondingly is that the monopoly to provide security, which is what the British government claimed, and to some degree the US government has claimed, that will no longer hold. It's no longer going to be a monopoly of the government to provide security. Somehow, just as the ability to kill is diffusing outside the government, in some way the requirement to provide security has to diffuse outside the government. If it doesn't, in order to prevent a catastrophic biological attack, the government will have to assume authority and power that dwarfs anything the excise officers in the British government exercise. Because ultimately, for example, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that there was a woman, I think in Cambridge, she was a graduate of MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was in a closet in her bedroom. She shared an apartment with two other people. In the bedroom of her closet, she had put together a little DNA mixing lab, and she was messing around with DNA. If somebody can do that in the closet of their bedroom, if it's the government's, if security is a government monopoly, then it means, you know, as they say, well, put it this way, it'll give new meaning to that argument about, you know, not having the government in your bedroom, because they'll be in your closet to find out if you're one of the people that's fooling around with DNA and why you're doing it. If that's the future you want, that can come from a government. That will come if the government maintains its monopoly. If you want a future in which the government doesn't have that kind of authority, we have to invent, for the first time in the history of modern nation states, we have to invent a way to let responsibility for security diffuse outside the government. So that's the context behind this argument about biosecurity. There are lots of other ways this comes up. Lots of technologies raise this. Another way this comes up is with regard to information technology, you know, the internet, computers, and so forth. And we can talk about talk about that too. Let me, one final comment, and then we can talk about this. There is a very interesting book written by a guy named Perrow, Charles Perrow. And it's called The Next Catastrophe. It came out a couple of years ago. I mentioned this for the following reason. Peter mentioned my bipartisanship. So I want to mention, in the spirit of bipartisanship, Perrow takes the view that the solution to the problem is actually not less government, it's more government. And he looks at, for example, the not nuclear, well, he does actually look at the nuclear power industry, but he looks at the electric generating and transmission industry. And he says that the big problem is that it was deregulated. Because as we all know, as Adam Smith knew, if you leave businessmen in a room alone, within a few minutes they'll be conspiring to collude to raise prices and to get rid of competition. And he says that's exactly what happened when the government deregulated the power industry in the early 90s. And as a result, we have a power generating and transmission system that is much more fragile and much more vulnerable than it was 30 years ago, because of the fact that business people in the environment of deregulation have, in effect, colluded. Perrow comes close to arguing that the greatest threat to our national security is the profit motive, which I'm not saying he's right about that, but there's a way in which his argument almost amounts to that. But I think it's actually, it is an important argument, and it's contrary to the way Wittes presents the problem, and it's also, frankly, contrary to the way I tend to think about the problem. And he's somebody who's saying that there are certain cases in which concentrating power in the hands of the government or increasing the power of government will actually make us more secure. Right? So that's something. One thing we can do when we're talking about this is to think about whether that kind of argument makes more sense, and in what cases it might make more sense. Does it make sense with regard to the internet? Does it only make sense with regard to the electric power industry? What are the characteristics that might lead to one being a good solution in one case and not in another? Let me just stop there, as offering that again, as I said, as a kind of context for what I hope we can have as a discussion, or if we're lucky, an argument about some of these things. So I will stop there and hope that you have some questions.
If we decide that protection of the United States needs to become sort of a power that is not of the government, is it really safe to trust, sort of mercenary organizations with protection more than it is to trust a volunteer army?
Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody have an answer for that? Good question. Well, let me ask you this: Why would you think that? Do you have an answer yourself?
Well, I mean,
what would be yours if you?
I guess the fear would be if we were to sort of decentralize the protection of the United States, that military protection would just become like another business, and so then you would have sort of people competing for profit and sort of undermining things and not keeping everything out and open to the public. I mean, and granted, the government does do that to a certain extent, but I think people are more willing to not trust the government than they are to not trust, a bunch of mercenary organizations. I mean, I feel like the secrecy would be less palpable if it were, sort of to go out and search for who we want to protect.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing is it was not unusual. Let me put it this way: it was typically the case until only a couple of hundred years ago that states really didn't have a monopoly over. Nation states didn't have a monopoly over the use of armed force, and we now when we think of pirates, you know, I guess we think of Johnny Depp, right? Pirates of the Caribbean. But actually, pirates were people who were, you know, they were authorized on behalf of a government to go out and do its fighting for it, privateers. And there were lots of arguments. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to try to figure out why governments decided that system didn't work very well. And I think part of what you're describing is right. There was I guess you could say, a prejudice that developed in favor of the view that when it comes to the use of violence, governments are more trustworthy. There's more control. We, as individuals, citizens, have more control over the government than we have over private industry that would be set up and contracted by the government to carry out those actions. So, you know, you can see this if you look at Iraq, when there were in fact, if you want to, you know, mercenaries, kind of a loaded term, but there were contractors hired to guard, and the argument was that they didn't have the highest training standards, lower standards than the U.S. military. They weren't as reliable. Is that really true, or is that just a prejudice? You know, might there be some kinds of security that you could contract out, and others that you wouldn't want to under different circumstances?
I mean, ordinary police forces weren't always run by a city and municipality.
Right. I mean, one thing that I learned in writing Illuminating the Dark Arts of War was to look at the growth of police forces in the United States, and this was largely done. I mean, prior to, say, you know, the 1830s or 40s, it was largely a voluntary, policing was largely a voluntary activity. So, you know that example, if you read the Wittes article, remember he tells this story at the end about when he was a little kid with his father and he's coming back from playing ball and somebody snatches the purse of some woman and she screams and 10 people take off after the guy and they run, or, you know, and they chase him down blocks later and tackle him and hold him till the police come. That was kind of the way policing was done. You know, a posse, you know, you watch old Westerns and the sheriff gets a posse. Well, there's a sheriff, but if he really needs to get something done, he says, okay, all you guys, you know, you're deputies now, let's go get the bad guy, right? The militia spirit in the United States, you know, that every citizen, you know, every male citizen has to be prepared to bear arms. That was a voluntary, it's not mercenary, but that was a way in which responsibility for security was dispersed. Organized through the government, but largely carried out by private citizens who weren't professional policemen or professional soldiers. Something like that is what Wittes is saying we have to go back to, at least with regard to biological stuff. If we don't want a government that literally will be in every nook and cranny of our lives to find the one out of a million who's actually going to try to carry out such an attack.
Just as a follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you think that, well, I come from a military family, and I know that there are, unfortunately, a lot of people in the military who are not in the military because of sort of a sense of patriotism, but are there to, you know, sort of get a paycheck. And do you think that that would become worse if we were to open up sort of the realm of defense to private industry? That you would have more people not protecting the country because they love the country, but because they want to make money off of it?
You know, my sense is that wouldn't change. You know, nobody, and for this reason, nobody's proposing that we do away with the current military we have. What Wittes and other people would say is that if you're thinking about terrorists, if you're thinking about sabotage, if you're thinking about people trying to bring down the electrical power grid, that military is irrelevant. It's not going to stop that. Remember, there's one thing where he says, I don't know if I can find it quickly. Yeah, this is on page 7. He says, the difficulty of attribution, which means, you know, the people we're concerned about they don't wear uniforms. They hide who they are. They don't want anyone to know who they are. So it's hard to figure out that they actually did it. If somebody puts a virus or something on your computer, how do you know who did it? Well, actually, you know, people do figure that out, but it's hard to do it. And so that's the problem of attribution, or the difficulty of attribution, combined with the fact that authorities may not learn of an attack until symptoms emerge days or weeks after infection. Remember, he's talking about somebody who reinvents smallpox and infects himself and then infects lots of other people and is buried, and nobody knows that he's gone around infecting people because it takes so long for the infection to manifest itself. He says these two things blunt the effectiveness of traditional models of deterrence and response. So the U.S. military understands itself to be, its ability to respond will actually deter somebody. In other words, if you attack the United States and you do that openly, you are going to get hit back very hard. And that discourages people from attacking. They hit us, then we can't hit them back, we can't respond. Right? So Wittes is saying, under that circumstance, the military it's irrelevant for that problem. It may be good for fighting China 20 years from now, but it's not going to be good for stopping hackers attacking the power grid or somebody spreading a biological device. So what he's counting on there is the fact that very elemental things, perhaps, people care about their families, and they will be motivated to take responsibility for security because they don't want their families hurt. So it will be local, community-based. I mean, he doesn't offer a description of this, and it's up to all of us, if we take that argument seriously and we're convinced by his argument, to then think through how, as a practical matter, this would be done. So I don't think it necessarily implies any change to the way the U.S. military is currently organized, the volunteer force, or any change in the motives of people in that force. It's really suggesting that this problem is, all of that goes back several hundred years to the way the British invented the modern world and the modern military and its connection to the state. And what Wittes is saying is that technology is developed in such a way that we have to rethink. We have a new problem, and we have to think anew about how to deal with that problem. The old ways of dealing with it won't work, and if we try to make them work, it will fundamentally change the character of government in such a way that you'd be hard put to call it a free government anymore. I mean, there really would be, the Fourth Amendment would not mean what it has meant. The right to privacy would be severely curtailed. That seems to be the consequence. And if we want to avoid that, we have to think of some new way to do this.
You know, we sort of have the luxury of hating government. It kind of works out really well for us.
Hating government?
Or at least being very wary of it.
Right.
And so when the government does things, we sort of feel free to rail against it. And I guess maybe this is outside the practical application of being afraid of diseases and things, cars blowing up and stuff. But does it create a cultural problem to decentralize security? I mean, in the news just now, we had the one, the Latino neighborhood watchman who shot the 17-year-old, and immediately he was kind of cleared for it, and now people are signing and marching. So I don't know how to turn out, but
Right.
Does it create a problem if that becomes the status quo, where people start to not just because it is that way, but it's actually their duty to suspect the people around them of things? I mean, if the government does it, we can feel okay because it's the government and we know what to dislike.
Yeah, I think that's really a great point. What you're saying is that, or you're raising the issue of whether the decentralization of security would not mean that we would transfer our suspicion from the government to suspicion toward our fellow citizens. So you're saying in the sense that the traditional way of doing this, the government took that burden and provided this kind of sphere of security in which we could live our lives. We didn't have to go around suspecting our fellow citizens.
I mean, if we're locking executing the law of nature, we can receive that. But I mean, this would not be that; it would be taking it back.
You're right, right. And so your view of this would be: aren't you talking about reinstituting the state of nature in civil society to some degree?
Yeah, and I talked to an anarchist a few months ago at Danton. I think I don't know where you are, but we talked about this. An anarchist, Danton was not the anarchist. I talked with Danton about this anarchist, and he was just talking about how anarchy seems to be the natural future because of everything that you were talking about, the diffusion of responsibility, either with security or even energy. So that seems like it would be the end of something like that if we, as you said, could return to the state of nature. So I was just kind of trying to flesh it out.
Yeah, I mean, that's one possibility. I mean, whether you understand the state of nature to be, solitary, nasty, brutish, etc. This would be, this state of nature would be long, right? The way technology is developing, it doesn't have to mean decentralization. Here's an example, talking about stuff you read in the newspaper. So I read today in the newspaper that in Brazil, they have a new program where they issue T-shirts to school-age children, which have a radio transmission device in them. And they can track the kids everywhere they go, so they know whether they're in school or not, for example. Okay. Now, presumably you could take the T-shirt off, right? I guess, right? But maybe what you need to do in that case is to put it into your earlobe, so you can't take it off. And it'll be under the skin. It's there permanently. They can track all these kids. That's why they can make sure they get to school. That's a good thing, right? We want kids in school. Now that technology means there could be somebody sitting at a console in one central place in Rio de Janeiro, tracking every school kid in the city. That would be a huge centralization of power, and the technology will make that possible. So if Wittes and others are saying that technology is going to diffuse power, that's true, but it also means that there are ways in which the government could use that technology to centralize power and information over people. Right? That's just as, it seems to be just as likely. And the issue about whether that happens or not is a political. It's up to us, in a sense, to decide whether that happens. I'm not making some kind of technological determinist argument. I think both kinds of things could happen, or are happening.
I wonder if we aren't seeing an example of the kind of thing that this is talking about in the proliferation of firms that now specialize in protecting consumers from identity theft. Right? Here's something that the perception is that the government is incapable of keeping this from happening, or in protecting our interests if it does happen. And these firms are increasingly going out and using technology to track down cases of this and break up these rings.
Yeah, and maybe, depending on how there's no reason the government couldn't do that. If we want to give the government the authority to do that. If we want to say to the government, in effect, I'm so concerned about identity theft that I want you, the government, to be able to track all of my bank accounts, all my purchases with credit cards, et cetera, in order to make sure, to run those same algorithms, to make sure suddenly my card's not being used in Hong Kong, et cetera. The government could do that. But we don't want the government to do that. So we hire people, we contract with people, and that's a free choice on both sides, and both sides think they're gaining something from it. And that seems better to us, a way of preserving our freedom rather than giving that authority to the government. Right? One thing that occurred after 9/11, this is connected to this issue of freedom more than it is to this biosecurity stuff. But there was a program that that the Defense Department tried to start. It was called initially it was called Total Information Awareness. And the argument behind the program was, if we could track what the 19 people did, how they went about getting on the airplanes the morning of 9/11. We know they used credit cards, cell phones, et cetera, et cetera. They left a huge information trail. If we gathered all of that information about them and we analyzed it with the kinds of techniques that are available now, could we find a pattern? Okay, so could we find, this is a question, hypothetical. Could we find a pattern? If we found that pattern, could we gather all the information, every credit card transaction, every cell phone, every airline ticket bought, et cetera, in the United States? Could we gather all that information and analyze it to see if that same pattern was recurring? Now, that it's not within the, at least as I understand it, it wasn't when this idea came up, within the realm of the possible. This was going to be carried out by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The people who originally, it wasn't Al Gore, they are actually the people who originally invented the internet. So the question was, could this actually be done? And the DARPA, every government thing has an acronym, DARPA, set out contracts to various research organizations for bits of this project to see if it could be done. The thought was, if you collected all this data, if you could first identify that pattern, and then, having identified it, if you could discover it occurring again through all this other data you collected, you could get those people and stop them from carrying out another 9/11. Once Congress, and there were, if we could talk about, there's a lot more about this project, but there were safeguards built into this. It may sound as if there couldn't be, but there were, and you could argue that they were inadequate, et cetera. That's what Congress ultimately, well, I wouldn't even say that. Congress ultimately said that DARPA couldn't spend money doing this, and the project was shut down. Was that a wise decision? I think ultimately the decision was made not on its technical feasibility, not even on the question of whether the safeguards really would have worked or not. It was made simply on the judgment that it was politically unacceptable for the government to collect even anonymous information on individuals, information that had been anonymized. Is that what the term is, anonymized? It simply was unacceptable for the government to do that. But there's no it's not. That was a political thing. It wasn't a technical thing, and the government could collect that information, right? But there was a political judgment made, and the way political judgments are made, that was not an acceptable thing to do. But if there is a biological attack, if the kind of thing that Wittes describes occurs, will people rethink that decision? Will they say, okay, we just 500,000 people died in a biological attack that dwarfs the number of people killed on 9/11. We simply can't let that happen again. Therefore, we are going to see if we can gather all this information on people. Or we are going to launch surveillance programs that are much more intrusive than anything anyone ever thought could have happened. Technically, if that's not possible now, we talk about bugs. Well, very soon we'll have little mechanical bugs, be no bigger than that can do, audio, video, crawl around your house. You'll never know they're there. They will record everything you do, everything you say. There's even, if you really want to get science fiction-y about it, there's even people working on reading brain waves. We'll all have to walk around wearing aluminum foil hats, you know. Now that sounds really crazy, but I think there's actually no limit to what the technology can do, will be able to do. I mean, there may be some, I'm not a technologist, but it's remarkable when you read about the kinds of things that people are thinking about or these possibilities that are emerging. So having, you know, little electronic signaling things in the t-shirts of school-age kids in Rio de Janeiro will seem quaint and you know, old-fashioned and ineffective.
So I was wondering, like, how you would sort of formulate like a restructuring of like Department of Homeland Security, where it's kind of this conglomerate of things, Coast Guard, it's FEMA, it's this, it's that. You don't actually have a central office. It's, you know, there's like 5 different sections around DC with Homeland Security offices in it. But part of the argument for putting all those organizations together was for the ease of information sharing. And so if you sort of diffuse, like, you know, things like security and that, like how would information sharing like be maintained, or like how would that usefulness of centralizing things like that, you know, how would it still be useful if you diffuse it?
But there is a kind of an assumption, or maybe not, but it seems to me you're assuming that it actually was useful to make this massive government agency.
Well, at least that was part of the argument, I guess.
Right, right. Yeah, I personally, I think that it's kind of an example of what's wrong with the panic response. I don't think anybody really thought through the problems. It just seemed like a good idea, right? I mean, one reason people thought 9/11 occurred is because people didn't know everything. And that's true, they didn't know everything that they could have known. But putting all of those organizations together under one heading didn't solve that problem, and there's no reason to think that it ever will solve that problem. If you take a look, if you're interested in what happened to FEMA, a large part of Perot's book is about that, and his argument, and I haven't really studied this independently, but I'm persuaded by what he says, which means it kind of accords with my prejudice. But FEMA is much less effective today than it was prior to 9/11 and prior to the establishment of DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And he argues that it won't ever be effective again unless DHS is taken apart again.
Just to follow up, I guess that was sort of my way of like asking the question of like, do you think the Department of Homeland Security is worthless? Which we kind of do. I mean, it is in a lot of ways, because it's, you know, it's now what it mainly does is just relegated to planning for something after it already happens. And so as far as what they're able to do, I mean, they really can't do anything until something bad happens. Like if, you know, the breakdown of Homeland Security in all the states, their emergency management agencies are actually running almost all of it. And I mean, is there a sensible way that you can think of to restructure something that you could call the Department of Homeland Security to where it's actually effective in providing security rather than cleaning up after something terrible has happened?
I think the answer is no. I think, I mean, I guess there's a couple of things what I'm thinking about is, one is if the assumption, another way to put it is that they were, in asking the question the way you asked it and talking about it that way, and if I were to respond that way, the assumption would be that there's an organizational solution to the problem. And it seems to me that's not true. It could never be true. The real question, I guess, is how much risk are we we as American citizens, how much risk are we willing to live with? if somebody says that there's a, one chance in 1,000 that there will be a nuclear device set off in the United States, would you be willing to live with that risk? If the alternative was, say, a significant reduction in your First and Fourth Amendment rights. So an example is, Wittes brings up this, which is a case which has continued after the publication of his article, but two groups of scientists figured out how to mess around with the bird flu virus, and they were going to publish their results, and the government said, don't do that, because we really don't want the bad guys, as Wittes says, to know how to turn this virus into something that's readily transmissible between human beings. So we're gonna have pre-publication censorship. We're gonna stop publishing that stuff. Is that acceptable if it reduces the risk of a biological attack in the United States? I mean, there's no answer to that question. Each of us individually will have some sense of what risk you're willing to run to avoid such an attack. And somehow out of that sense, individual sense, will emerge some political consensus about how much risk we're willing to run. I think after 9/11, most Americans felt we really do want to reduce the risk of a similar attack. But nobody really understood, I think, exactly what that risk was, and it's very hard to calculate it. But it could be that 9/11 is one of those cases where Perrow calls them normal accidents. It's from a previous book he wrote. But what he means by that is that it is possible, even with a lot of safeguards built in, that something bad will happen. Because there is always some chance that each of those safeguards will fail in such a way that the bad consequence that they're designed to prevent actually occurs. And there's not much anybody can do about that. So there's a sense in which we're not, we have to decide what's reasonable to prevent another attack, and then think about ways that we could recover from another attack. And the question that Wittes is posing is not, and he's I think pretty clear about this, not can we prevent this biological attack, but what are reasonable steps to take to reduce its likelihood, and what are the costs of those various approaches. And again, he says, one, if you take the decentralized approach, that might actually work as well as anything, and it avoids the consequence of having the federal government get vastly increased powers to conduct surveillance of American citizens. I realize that I haven't really answered your question, but I don't know that there is an answer to it. I mean, I believe that it's true that there isn't an organizational solution to this. Here's one reason why, and it has to do with the kind of character of information. So prior to 9/11, the argument was that there were too many restrictions on who knew what. And after 9/11, the US government took a lot of steps to change that. So it used to be that the common thing was to say that nobody should have information unless they have a need to know it. And in order to get access to information, you had to establish that you had that need. And people say, well, that's really what screwed things up prior to 9/11. That's what stopped information from being shared. So the government went to a kind of default that people should have information. And that's what led to WikiLeaks, right? Because everybody could get access to that information, and there was one of those people who decided that he wanted to reveal all that stuff that he now had access to. there's no way to fix that problem, because there's no way any central authority in the US government can know what everybody in the US government needs to know. So you either have to do it on a case-by-case basis, which means you're gonna stop the spread of information, or you have to say, yeah, everybody should have access to everything. And you can't, there's no way to resolve that problem. So now that, you know, WikiLeaks occurred, we've gone back to a system where information isn't shared as readily, and we're bound to get an instance where some terrorist gets into the United States because of that, and carries out an attack and kills X number of people. And then we'll say, okay, well, we've got to make sure everybody gets all the information. And then there'll be another WikiLeaks. And there's no organizational way to fix that problem. The only thing I would say is that I think Perrow's arguments are pretty good on the point of saying that the DHS has been a failure, and that it's not going to get, it's going to stay broken. Any other
Last question, maybe?
questions?
First, a comment. It seems to me the government did exactly the dumbest thing they could have done. They didn't say they couldn't publish it. It's my understanding they said put off for 60 days,
The article,
the articles.
yeah.
I don't know what good that does except get everybody mad, but. The second question, a little different than this, but since you are the smartest man that he knows, I'd like to know about the changing nature of war. And do you feel like in Afghanistan we are to the point where we no longer need boots on the ground? We're able to do through the internet and through other long distance things the identification of people. That means we no longer have to invade with a whole bunch of people. We just selectively do what we need to do underground.
You don't have to answer that. First, you don't have to be smart. That's a ridiculous thing. I'm kidding. He wants Solomonic wisdom.
No.
Okay, thank you.
That will never happen. I think people who believe that information technology can replace forces on the ground, or that sort of thing, it won't happen. There are lots of reasons why I think that's the case. But one is that there are many. I mean, if you think of Afghanistan, you're dealing with a place where information technology is not very important. But that would even be the case in the United States. If somebody could somehow take control of large segments of our information technology, that they wouldn't have control of the United States.
So you'll feel we'll need the Army divisions rather than the subterfuge forces?
Well, it depends what you're trying to do. If you want to actually control territory, you have to put U.S. forces on the territory. If you're trying to influence things that occur there, then there's all sorts of things you can do without putting U.S. forces on or large numbers of U.S. forces on the ground. And that's always been the case. That hasn't changed fundamentally.